Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Yarimar Bonilla. I am the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College, and we are so happy to be here at the Italian Studies Institute for a partner event today to discuss this wonderful novel in an academic discussion, but also a popular discussion. And I'm just here to welcome, but the proper introductions are to come. So welcome. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good evening and welcome to the John D. Calandra Italian American Institute. My name is Rosaria Musco. I am the Director of Administration here at the Calandra Institute. I just want to say that the Dean of the Institute, Anthony Tamburi, sends his greetings and his regrets due to unforeseen circumstances. He was not able to be here tonight, along with my colleague, Rosangela Briscese, who's the Assistant Director for Academic and Public Programs. She also sends greetings and regrets. She was unable to be here tonight, but the show must go on. She's usually better at this than I am, so bear with me. We are very excited to be here tonight as part of our Writers Read series with Christopher Sorrentino, along with Joseph Salvatore and Vanessa Perez Rosario. We are, Christopher will be reading from his book, Now Beacon, Now See. And again, we are delighted also to be partnering with the Centro, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. So I'm going to read first Christopher's bio, and it will be followed by Vanessa's and Joseph. So Christopher Sorrentino is the author of 6 books, including Trance, a National Book Award finalist for fiction, The Fugitives, and Now Beacon, Now See, a New York Times notable book in 2021. His work has appeared in A Public Space, The Baffler, Bomb, Book Forum, Conjunctions, Esquire, Fence, Granta, Harper's, the Los Angeles Times, McSweeney's. He was the writer in residence at Fairleigh Dickinson University in 2011. He has taught at Columbia University, New York University, the New School, and the Unterberg Poetry Center of the 96th Street Y. This is Christopher Sorrentino. Vanessa Perez Rosario is professor of English at Queens College and professor in the doctoral program in Latin American, Iberian Latino Cultures at the Graduate Center, the City University of New York. She's the author of Becoming Julia de Burgos, The Making of a Puerto Rican Icon, published in a Spanish edition, Julia de Burgos, La Creación de un Icon Puertorriqueño. She's editor of Hispanic Caribbean Literature of Migration, Narratives of Displacement. Vanessa Perez Rosario is managing editor of Small X, a Caribbean journal of criticism. She's curator of Off the Page, Conversations with Writers, a Queens College literary reading and speaker series. Last but not least, we have Joseph Salvatore. He's the author of the story collection To Assume a Pleasing Shape and the co-author of the college textbook Understanding English Grammar. A Spanish translation of his story collection, Presentarse en Forma Grata, was published in 2018 by Editorial Dos Bicotes. Did I say that right? In Madrid, Spain. He's the book's editor of the Brooklyn Rail and a frequent contributor to the New York Times Sunday Book Review. He's an associate professor of writing at the school in New York City, where he received the University Distinguished Teaching Award and was the founding editor of the literary journal Lit. These are our speakers for tonight, well, our discussants and our speaker, but without further ado, I present Christopher Sorrentino. Prego.
Thank you. Everybody, is this picking me up good enough? Does anybody have a reading? Okay. I wanted to, I know we have a little bit of time to fill, so I selected something that was a little longer. I abridged it a bit. I wanted to read this part of the book because, you know, for those who don't know, and there's no reason why you should yet, this is a book about my relationship with my mother, which was very fraught for many years and would go in and out of periods of eclipse. And this is at a point when she had to enter the hospital and then later nursing facility. And so this was the moment when our relationship more or less changed, and I figured out, and I think she figured out just as much, how we could deal with each other. And for the rest of her life, for another 4 years or so, she and I got along just fine. So I'm going to read from that. It's the 20th chapter of the book. On a gray and windy day in March 2013, I took a car service from my apartment in Kensington to Lutheran Hospital. Lutheran is located on 2nd Avenue, the ass end of Brooklyn, or one of its many ass ends. No matter how stupidly false New York seems to become under the siege of gentrification, there are always places like this to remind us just how ugly, just how degrading urban life can be at the core of its authenticity. To the south is the Brooklyn Army Terminal. To the north is the Metropolitan Detention Center. In between lie warehouses, garages, one-story industrial buildings, truck lots, abandoned construction sites, the occasional forlorn cluster of tenements. It's impossible to spend a moment here without feeling as if you too are being swept out of the world's sight. A dismally perfect spot for a hospital. In keeping with its surroundings, Lutheran's main building looks like it could be a cold storage facility, a hulking container painted battleship gray. Previous afternoon, I'd received a call from Nell, and parenthetically, that is my ex-wife. Have you spoken to your mother lately? She said. This was a familiar opening remark from her. She knew how things often stood between my mother and me. At that point, my mother and I hadn't spoken in a year. No, I said. I just got a call from her. She's in the hospital. She paused. She's been there a week. A week? And she just called you? Yep. What's wrong with her? In the last few years, my mother gradually had begun to suffer from multiple ailments, the most serious of which was chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Some of these ailments I'd heard about directly from her when we happened to be speaking, and others I had not. Her sciatica got so bad she couldn't walk, she said. She told me she finally had to call an ambulance. Sciatica? They had carried her out. No doubt whatever the pain, my mother had continued stubbornly to vacuum her floors and scrub her kitchen and bath. Typical. How long it had gone on, I had no way of knowing. I could imagine them putting the usual questions to her. Is there anyone you want us to call? No. Then she lay in her hospital bed for a week, eating the food, enduring the daytime TV, watching her roommates' visitors come and go, probably watching the roommates themselves come and go. When she decided to make a call, it had been to her ex-daughter-in-law. Typical. What hospital? Lutheran. Typical. My mother gets sick. She picks the one hospital that makes you want to commit suicide. Probably she didn't even pick it. Probably she left it to the EMS techs to decide. Maimonides is friendlier. Methodist is an earthly paradise by comparison. Even the massive Kings County downstate campus, traditional destination of the downtrodden, has a more human aspect. Flatbush is at least a real neighborhood with real street life. She goes to Lutheran, profound as a cinder block in a vacant lot. You expect to see tumbleweeds rolling lazily down 2nd Avenue. Typical, characteristic, pathological. Even my father, dying in the shittiest place imaginable, Victory Memorial, had had a view from the last room he occupied in this world of the Diker Beach golf course. Too bad he could no longer sit up to see it. Nell gave him the number at my mother's bedside. It took me 3 hours to work up the courage to call her. Calls to my mother always have this specific ritual associated with them. Wherever I happen to be, preferably at home, I sequester myself in a quiet room, a scarce commodity in our house. Perhaps I want to insulate my mother from the sounds of my life, of which she does not approve. Her disapproval is tacit, but completely legible nonetheless, and she's forbidden me to confront her about it. This is the larger part of the tension between us. My mother consents to deal with me as long as I don't insist that she also deal with Minna, with whom I've been living for 7 years at this point. The problem is that sometimes I become, if not insistent, balky. The problem is that I become resentful if I allow myself to sit and brood over the fact that my mother has never visited my apartment or met my stepson or invited us to join her for a holiday or birthday celebration, and that to propose such things to her would be completely pointless as they are not possibilities in her world. The problem is that, understandably, Minna finds the status quo insulting. The problem is that I dislike calling my mother to deliver carefully censored bits of news about my doings. censored to avoid contradicting her view of me and to avoid appearing to rebuke her static and solitary life. So the obligatory phone call to my mother, granted a genre of phone call familiar to millions of adult children of elderly parents, often seems to augur the worst. I don't like the phone generally. It's not a medium through which I communicate well, generally. It cuts me off from the cues I need to interpret her accurately. In person, I can tell when she's in a good humor and when she's irritated. I can tell when she's tired, when she doesn't feel well, when she's angry at me, and when she's angry about something that happened 50 years ago. I can tell when she's important and when impatient and when she's melancholy. I can tell when she's in the mood to reminisce and when she's done reminiscing. Above all, I can tell when the subject is closed, whether the subject concerns a personal matter, such as the location of her will and other personal documents, or something idly conversational, such as Bill Murray's performance in Broken Flowers. I do not like that man, she says. As a conversational gambit, my maneuver is risky, but not necessarily stupid, because my mother does like Jim Jarmusch. So I don't find out where the will is or ask how she felt about Murray in Coffee and Cigarettes. It takes me 3 hours to work up the courage to call her, because this has been a long silence, one specifically ordained by my mother in an email where she responded to my asking whether she wanted me to keep trying with a single word: no. So always the obedient son, I'd stopped. It wasn't difficult as decisions go. And yet, I picture her alone in the hospital, in that hospital. I see the nurses in their silly patterned scrubs, friendly or unfriendly, always efficient. I see the doctors in their glazed uninterest. There was a time when my mother was a prize patient. In Palo Alto, her rheumatologist made her case the subject of grand rounds on several occasions, residents and students gaping at her as she answered questions about her lupus and other afflictions. Now she simply suffers the commonplaces of aging, like anyone else among the elderly here at this working class hospital. In the hospital, as I picture her, she is more alone than she is at home. And this I can't bear. I am literally 15 minutes from her by car for the entire week she has been there. I have been 15 minutes from her. My insouciance concerning the rift between me and my mother is just a thin and sloppily applied coat over a number of more anxious emotions. Pain over not being loved, embarrassment over being one of those people who end up estranged from their parents, a feeling of being prematurely adrift in the world without the only person left who can confirm the earliest and most obscure facts of my own history, concern that my mother will disinherit me, and the prescient worry that my mother will end up dying unexpectedly and alone in her apartment, to be found God knows when by God knows who. I never quite could acknowledge to myself that most likely it would be me. And another parenthesis here, it was me. And it was a while afterwards. But also I feel compassion. Never enough, it occurs to me now, never enough compassion to insist on changing things, to insist on her increasing her tolerance for the unknown, never enough to overcome a fear of her displeasure that prevents me from being insistent, but also compassion for a lonely old woman who, having been dealt a shitty hand, has done nothing more egregious than to play it badly. I cannot bear her being alone in the hospital. There's not even the hint of an inner voice saying, fuck her, though that voice has certainly found its way out into the world to express similar sentiments many times over the preceding months, when my mother was simply and forbiddingly there, 6¼ miles away in Bay Ridge, immovable, immutable, a mountain I did not need to see to believe in, to feel the chill when I let it block the sun. At any rate, reluctant though I may be to make the call, I do not hesitate to do my duty to her. That sense of duty, how familiar. It's almost as if our estrangement has existed to test the durability of a mythical family pathology. The fortitude to see through what needs to be done, no matter how unhappy we are about it. In leaving Nell for Minna 7 years ago, I have, according to my mother, committed the most serious breach of this sense of duty in family memory. This is most emphatically not true. My family history on both sides is filled with abandonments, affairs, betrayals, disappearances, disinheritances, disownings, divorces, estrangements, fallings out, rifts. Some things people got over, some things people didn't get over, but only people like my mother cling, against all the evidence, to the idea that such events are anomalous and unnatural. A half-century of divorce and deracination had its way with us all, and was it all bad? Was it really better for those child brides and boy husbands of the past to stick it out until the bitter end? For no one to pitch their ambitions beyond the borders of the neighborhood and the family, as if after the Bronx came the edge of the world and an endless drop into the abyss? My mother couldn't possibly really believe that. The greatest effort of her young adulthood was expended in furious opposition to such ideas, in leaving home, in leaving her own first marriage. But my mother thinks that I am incapable of doing my duty, that I don't even acknowledge that I have a duty to anyone, to anything. Yet she seems pleased to hear from me when I call. It's a short chat, mostly to establish that I'll be coming to see her and to bring some things that she needs. I do not scold her. I decide well before dialing that I will not scold her for not calling me earlier, for having allowed herself to deteriorate. Scolding doesn't work, even scolding disguised as affectionate scolding. My mother does not feel cared for when someone suggests that she could treat herself better, that she deserves more, whether it's better groceries, better investments for her savings, having her air conditioner installed, receiving a doctor's care before she cripples herself. And what's the point? She's already in the hospital. What happened? Oh, my mother begins, this damn sciatica. I didn't know you had sciatica. I told you, Chris. Why do you think my back is always bothering me? Okay. Anyway, what happened? It got so bad I couldn't walk at all. I couldn't get out of bed one day. So you called an ambulance. I called the doctor. He called the ambulance. Okay. So what's been going on at Lutheran? What do you mean? I'm just sitting here. I'm hospitalized. But they're treating you. They have me on antibiotics. For sciatica? No, Chris. They say I have cellulitis. Oh, okay. All right. My stomach is in turmoil. So the diagnosis is cellulitis and sciatica, and something with my heart. Your heart? Chris, you remember when I had heart failure that time? No, I say. No, I don't remember when you had heart failure that time. When? Recently? Oh, years ago. I told you, Chris. So, I say, unsure of what I'm asking. Are they fixing it? It turned out that fixing it wasn't exactly what they were doing. They had her on formidable doses of antibiotics to kill the cellulitis and on ACE inhibitors for the inflammation they'd discovered in her heart. But primarily, they were hydrating and feeding my mother, who, when I walked into the room she shared with two other women, was unrecognizable. She was emaciated, the bare skin of her arms shrunken and wrinkled, as well as black and blue from the intravenous drip she was on. She'd lost a lot of flesh on her face, revealing her high cheekbones and the fine contour of her jaw, although any flattering effect this might have had was offset by the fact that she was now missing so many teeth that the lower half of her face had a sunken look. Her hair had thinned considerably and finally had become more gray than not. She had a slight tremor. She looked ready for the grave. It was, I thought, like looking at her corpse. That was my second thought. My first thought was, she's had it. She was 75, but I'd become accustomed to the 21st century 75, the 75 of vigorous exercise, of intrepid world travel, of vocational productivity, of sexual insatiation, of new beginnings. My mother's 75 was a throwback to the dark ages of the mid-20th century, when 70 was what you could expect, preceded by a steep decline into senescence. My third thought was, this is my fault. The beds in the small room were wedged in every which way, and she was sitting up in hers. I was surprised to see she was talking on the phone. It was to Alba, my cousin, her cousin, my titi. She interrupted the call to allow me to press my lips against her cheek. Chris just got here, she said into the phone. Then she held it out to me. Here, she said, talk to your aunt. Titi Alba, who had recently been diagnosed with cancer and would die at the end of the year, spoke with the staccato, syllable-timed New York accent distinctive to people of Puerto Rican descent, the accent my mother would have had she not decided not to have it. So you're going to take care of your mother, right? She said. Titi was always no bullshit. She knew perfectly well that my mother and I hadn't been talking, but she was happy I was there. Clearly, my mother had called to let her know that I was coming, that I wasn't going to let her down. We talked for a few minutes more. Alba was 5 months younger than my mother, and growing up, they'd been as close as sisters. She was now legally blind, living in Connecticut with my cousin Amanda, and about to face the final ordeal. But these facts were unimportant. She had intuited exactly what I had, the same emotional barrenness about my mother's being alone in a Brooklyn hospital. Alone, hospital, Brooklyn. The combination of any two of those three words was enough to pierce the heart. Alba had buried a husband. She'd buried a mother. She'd buried a father. She'd raised daughters. She'd been a daughter. The rightness of my being there was a given. What she managed to impress on me during our brief conversation, eloquently, but without really mentioning it at all, was that a thing's rightness gave no one the privilege to expect it. It was good that I was there because it was just as likely that I might not have been. When we were done talking, I asked if she wanted me to put my mother back on. No, she'd saved the end of the call for me. My mother and I were then on our own, albeit in the presence of her roommates and the hospital staff busying in and out. We handled it the way we generally handled the mending of our relations, understatedly. My mother had been fairly explicit that clearing the air was not something she was interested in doing. I'm still surprised to consider the possibility that for my mother, the most ferocious, tenacious arguer I've ever encountered, the prospect of confrontation was too painful or daunting. I wonder what she imagined I had to say to her. This is, of course, the era of latent accusation. It's possible that she thought I had found her liable for some act, error, or omission committed in the distant past, a historical outrage of which I had decided to declare myself a justice-seeking survivor. That was never my thing. I don't think of myself as a victim or of my mother as an abuser. She crossed the line sometimes, but who doesn't cross a line from time to time? We are a depraved species, and only the spiritually bourgeois believe in their own moral perfection. My mother's behavior toward me was not systematically cruel, nor was it sadistic. She took no pleasure in it. It did not give her relief, although I think she was always seeking relief. She sought relief in outbursts, and she sought it in silence. My mother was trying to quiet the static in her brain, the angry dissatisfaction that never went all the way away. And now my childhood was decades in the past, so really she had nothing to fear from me in terms of recriminations. What I would have had to say to her, had it been imaginable to say it, would have had to do with the way she and I lived in relation to the world and to each other. My mother remote from everything and passively and impatiently waiting for me to join her in her remoteness, and me resisting her pull but refusing to pull back. I thought she was unhappy, and it made me unhappy. I thought she would be happier if she tried some of the things that she was convinced she was incapable of, all of which involved encounters with the most pedestrian unknowns. I thought that if she tried such things, it might encourage her to try others. That's what I would have talked to her about. Now, though, I could see that it was much too late. My mother was obviously dying. She wasn't. What would have been the point? I thought of the people who had once been important to her, dozens of people, daily parts of her life, of our lives, and they were dead. They were gone, they were missing, nothing would bring them back, and no one would substitute for them. Céline wrote, "The living people we've lost in the crypts of time sleep so soundly side by side with the dead that the same darkness envelops them all. And now its shadows had begun to creep closer." Enough, I said, enough already. On her behalf and in her best interests, I am deciding that she never has to deal with the inconvenient complication of my life, with my importunate reminders of it, with my threatening invitations to immerse her in an impossible reality. My mother has become who she has become. How much time could she have left to change it to something that suits me and no one else? Enough already. I should either go on or I mean, there's another, I mean, I could stop or I could go on. I did cut a bunch out, but this is a lengthy chapter, as I said, and I don't know if you guys want to just get started on the discussion now.
I'd love to get started on the
let's
discussion,
do that.
but
then.
partly you ended at the perfect spot. The
Okay,
enough
good.
already section. I think
Enough
is,
already. Good.
No.
Sure. Thank you for that reading. It's so nice to get to hear you read it. There's so much to talk about, and with the memoir, and I really enjoyed it. And I think, I mean, I hope we'll have time to get through my notes and my questions, but I think maybe I'll start with, you know, one of the things that as I was trying to understand your relationship with your mother, one of the things that really stood out to me and that I was very interested in is this question of your mother's anger. There's earlier on, you write about her anger being formidable and what she's able to do with that anger, that she uses it in a particular way to be able to bend things to her will. And I wonder if you could talk about that?
Sure, I can. I mean, it's only possible to talk about it anecdotally, really, but it was sort of her superpower in a way, and I think that it worked a lot. The context in which I discuss it in the book that I think Vanessa's paraphrasing has to do with my mother moving through the neighborhood in which I spent my early childhood, which was on the Lower East Side, which was degenerating and becoming a very bad neighborhood in the mid to late 60s. And my mother was able, by asserting herself in a kind of uncompromising way, which generally manifested itself as irritation or anger. She was able, by that means, to avoid the kinds of encounters that might otherwise have turned into bad business for her, or for me or for anyone. So my mother would shout, or she would yell, or she would just be very unpleasant. And I'm not talking about with me, although she would do that too sometimes, but mostly with, I think the people I list are like shopkeepers and, bums on the street, panhandlers, people who otherwise were, maybe doing, ruffians, out there doing ruffian stuff. So it was definitely a strength that she had, and it did bend things to her will, and it did help her achieve some of the objectives she was trying to achieve, even very short-term objectives like, gee, how do I get from the laundromat to my apartment without being accosted by this like drunk guy on the street? But it's not an easy one to turn off, I think. So I think my mother was often, she was drawing on something that was always very, very close to the surface. There wasn't an affectation. It wasn't something that she was putting on in any way. It was just like right there. And if you rubbed her just a little bit the wrong way, she had access to it for you. And of course, that applied at home or in social situations, in addition to applying to situations that were, unwanted.
Throughout the book, I'm glad you mentioned the anger. It comes up in that section. I'm so glad you read that section. So many things happening in that block of prose you just read that I was thinking I would go one way with my question and then another way. And when you ended with enough already, I was not joking about the amount of reading. I was thinking this is the moment in the book where there is finally a change with Chris, with our narrator, with you, with the memoir's author. Enough already becomes a kind of mantra, an incantation that you finally kind of settle on, which is the way you will live with your mother for the rest of her days. Somehow the anger, and it's funny because by the moment we get to that's an extended bit of dialogue for this
Yeah,
memoir.
there's not a lot of dialogue.
And I love that you read that, because when I read that part, I thought, I've been waiting to see her dramatized, because there's these moments where she's coming at people and she's fighting for her son, and she's fighting with the butcher and all this stuff. But to see her with you, and the amount of time she uses your name, and just the way that stubbornness and that feistiness, and she's lying there almost foreshadowing the opening of the book, the way you find her.
Right.
But when I think about all we have come through in this memoir to get to that part at the end, it makes me think that maybe we could pull back a little bit and think about two things. One is the actual decision you made as a fiction writer to come at this material, your mom's material, this powerful stuff, in the form of a memoir. I am a fan of your novel, Trance. I taught a seminar in Don DeLillo, and Trance came up several times in relation to his book on Libra. You're writing about Patty Hearst and Trance, and the narrative techniques you use, how clever and sly the book is at coming at various ways it tells its story, seems to be kind of stripped away in this memoir. And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about how the content was connected to the form. Your mother died on May 27, 2017. How long was it before you started writing this memoir? Talk about the decision. Sure. And the work that went into being a memoir.
Well, I think I always knew I was going to write about my mother, and I think I always was certain that I wasn't going to do it until she died. And so I think that idea began to come to me within a few weeks. I mean, it was interesting. Those of you here who've suffered an unexpected death in the family, you may or may not have experienced it the way I did, but for me, the experience was one in which I didn't really register it as a feeling for many, many months afterwards. I mean, it was shock and a kind of numbness, which I think I've often heard described under those circumstances, and also, this immediate need to start taking care of business because I don't really have any effective siblings, and my father's been dead for a long time. So it was really just me taking care of every aspect of her estate and her apartment and all of that stuff. So I had a lot of work to do. And so in this interval between, discovering her and starting to grieve, I had a lot of time to sort of think about it in a creative sense. And it happened to occur, Joe, at a really interesting moment. I had just finished about a 300-page section of a novel I'd been working on for maybe 2 years at that point. And it was a major section of the book, of which there were like another 50 pages. So it's like a substantial chunk of the book that I'd been working on for perhaps a year and a half or so, that I was pleased enough with, but I felt as if it was going to require a lot of work. And it was, I wouldn't say it was transient, if I can coin a word, but I would say that it was Baroque enough, it was elaborate enough, it was reliant upon foregrounded literary techniques and other fictional devices that I feel, pretty fluent in. And yet I knew there was something wrong with that book, and it's taken me up till very recently to kind of figure out how to solve the problems with it, but that's an entirely different story. The point is, I was having trouble with an existing project, and I suddenly had a pretext to create a different project, which was one that I'd already given myself permission to pursue long beforehand. And so I immediately started doing that, probably around September of 2017, so about 3 months after she died. And I think it was always on my mind to strip it down. I think it seemed to me to be appropriate for this book to write it in comparatively plain way, even though the language itself gets a little rococo at times and is sort of deliberately set up as being sort of supercilious. I think one of the first things I decided to do was to create a narrator. It's I, and it's intended to represent me, but it's really not the way that I talk. It's really not the way that I approach things. But I wanted to make this guy who's telling us the story sound, a little bit like he had come about as far as it was possible to come from his parents' origin, because both of my parents are first-generation Americans. Both of my parents come from the working class. Both of my parents, had in a lot of ways that are not familiar to me in my own experience, had to struggle to find themselves, to educate themselves, to live a more, to acquire more sophisticated tastes, to live a more enlightened life, however you would like to put it. So I was like, okay, this narrator is the sort of Frankenstein product of that process. He's this sort of like snob, who puts down Lutheran Hospital for being on 2nd Avenue, and that's what I wanted to do. In terms of stripping it down, that's a decision I've been coming toward for a few years, just generally in my prose. For a long time, I was trying to hit it out of the park, and for a long time, I was actually talking about this with someone not too long ago. It's like, the idea behind trance really was to like kind of showcase how impressed I was with my own skills and talent. And, I did it fairly effectively. It's not a terrible book, but it's not as good as I thought it was. And I kind of felt years after having completed it, which is when I started this book, about 12 or 13 years after having completed it, the way I felt about my prose was that the best way to sort of correct it of like a lot of the flaws that I baked into it over the preceding years or so was to just kind of undo it. Because I always find that editing or revision by deletion is almost always the most effective strategy. It's like changing things. Yeah, of course you do that, but it's not quite as satisfying as just removing things and making them smaller, simpler. And so I think that's really the spirit in which this book was composed. You know, the writing of it, the emotional experience of having written it was something else entirely, although, I don't know, those of us who are writers may be able to sympathize with this, but for me, writing isn't really an emotional experience. Reading what I've written is sometimes an emotional experience. You know, to come to terms with writing this book, I had to have written it first. I don't think there were any moments that gave me pause in the writing of the book, because that might have been an obstacle to actually completing it. So what I did instead was write it, you know, no regrets, and then suddenly it's in proofs, and it's going to be published, and you're reading it set in type, and you're like, holy shit, did I really say this? Holy shit, you know? So yeah, it's a little, you know, it's always a little daunting. I mean, I guess I feel that way about every single book I've written. Like, there's the book you've been living with all these years, and then there's the book that everybody else is looking at, and you're like, I can't believe they're looking at this, you know?
I have a question maybe along, since we're talking about craft, before we move on to other topics, just 2 quick questions, I guess. There's a moment in the memoir where I think you say, you write, I should have looked it up, but you write about going back and looking at journals. And
oh, yeah.
I wonder if that was part of the process of writing this. And were you looking at journals that you've written a long time ago? I wondered what that was about, if you could say something about that. And then I also wondered, you know, as I was reading the book, and we come to your mother, who's Puerto Rican, and her birth certificate says that she's Black. And of course, the first thing I do is flip through to see if there are any pictures, and there are no pictures like one might expect in a memoir. So I wonder if you could talk about those two, that partly that if that was part of the process of looking at these old journals that maybe you'd written, and the decision not to include.
They were more of a reference than an inspiration, I would say. I used the journals. I've been keeping a journal not that long. I only started keeping one about 10 years ago, and I started keeping it because I felt as if I was out of touch with reality, because I was having a really hard time at that point. And I talk about it a little bit in this book. Not too much, because it's kind of irrelevant, but I was having a hard time, and I didn't think that, you know, a lot of people were telling me that, like, my experience as I remembered it did not actually reflect reality. So I was like, okay, if I write all this stuff down, then I'll be able to keep track of reality. So what I really have is a record of like how messed up I was about 10 years ago, which is, you know, interesting in and of itself. But I did happen to write down like stuff that happened to me, which is really of very little interest to anyone except me. And a lot of the stuff that happened to me involved like dealing with my mother or not dealing with her, as the case may have been, because there was, I think around the time when I started writing it, my mother and I were going through one of our long silences, because my mother and I fell out at least 3 or 4 times after my father died. He was really the thing that kind of kept us in a relationship. Like, it was a forced relationship. It was like Tito dying and Yugoslavia falling apart, you know? So I referred to the journal to find out occasionally. I mean, it was really simple, kind of rudimentary search. I just type in mom, and like, you know, like page after page would pop up. And mom said this, mom did that, mom refused to answer this letter I'd written her, mom refused to pick up when I called her on the phone, you know, whatever it happened to have been. So yeah, I wouldn't say it was like it served as a basis for anything. It was just more like, okay, what about the time that she saw the hematologist, and he told her that he thought maybe she had, you know, whatever kind of cancer he thought she had at that point. And so I'd look that up, and there it would be. And the other question having to do with her birth certificate. Yeah, I mean, you know, I can only speculate, really. I mean, I don't know too much about that. My presumption from the very small amount of reading on background that I did for this book is that in New York City, at least, they weren't quite settled on how they wanted to characterize Puerto Ricans. Now, most of us aren't even familiar with birth certificates that have a space for race. You know, I mean, mine doesn't, and that's 59 years old now. So they haven't been doing it for a long time, but back then they did. And as I say elsewhere in the book, it's interesting because if you look at various documents that I was able to unearth concerning my mother and my grandparents and my great-grandmother, they are referred to a variety of different ways. You know, they're referred to as Black, they're referred to as West Indian, they're referred to as white, you know, and it's always, you know, a little off, you know, it's just a little not quite correct. But I can say, as far as I can tell, genetically, you know, there's my mother does not have very much African descent. She's not an Afro-Latina, or she was not, I should say. I mean, I've got my own 23andMe results, and they say like, yeah, sure, you've got some of that in you, but as far as, you know, for all I know, it might have come from my father. You know, my father's people were Sicilians, and they're about like a long swim away from the coast of Tunisia. So it could have come from anywhere. So yeah, it's really, you know, to me, that's just like a strange kind of, like, I refer to it elsewhere in a different context, but there's kind of neither norness that inflected both my own upbringing, and I think more so for my mother, because she was in a kind of socio and cultural setting in which, like, you know, there was a strong kind of a strong incentive to lean in one direction rather than the other direction. And my mother decided around the time that her adolescence began that she wanted to lean in the other direction, away from the neighborhood, away from the culture, away from what she saw as happening to the kids that she knew. And that wasn't necessarily even exclusively a Puerto Rican thing. It was also the girls she knew in the Bronx who were, you know, Jewish girls, but they were all doing the same thing. I quote, it's one of my favorite quotes of all time. So I quoted in this book, and I've quoted it in about 5 other places, but Vivian Gornick once referred to, you know, she grew up just a few blocks from my mother and was just a couple of years older, although they never knew each other. But Gornick writes about how, you know, the kids she grew up with, their biggest ambition was to move from the working class part of the Bronx to the middle class part of the Bronx. And Gornick just didn't want that, you know? And so I would say my mother probably fits that to a T. My mother did not want to get a nice place on Marshallwood Parkway or something. She wanted to go down to Manhattan, and that's what she ended up doing, you know? And I think one of the ways that she, you know, I mean, there's a lot of wiliness here. There's a lot of shape shifting. You know, my mother changed her name from Vivian, or Vivian, as my grandparents called her, to Victoria when she was around 14 years old. And I think she thought it was more sophisticated. I think she thought it was more worldly. I think she thought it sounded less like an immigrant name, you know, like the kind of name that the immigrant kids had, you know. And so she changed it on her own, started referring to herself exclusively that way. Vivian became what I guess we would call today her dead name, although her family referred to her by it for as long as they were still in her life. And
obituary says Victoria Sorrentino.
Yep, well, that's the name she would have wanted to have,
absolutely.
you know, and so I gave her that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I never knew her as anything else. I mean, the funny thing was she never did it legally. So there are often, I write somewhere in the book about how she would periodically get like small checks from my great-grandfather's estate. My great-grandfather was a landowner in Villalba. And when he sold the land to a developer, I guess there was some sort of trust that was established. And my mother would get checks for like $500, $1,200, $300, you know. And one day she signed one of those checks over to me because I was broke as usual. So she gave me a check for like $1,200, hot stuff. That was like the rent. And I took it to the bank, but it was made out to like Vivian Ortiz Sorrentino. And, you know, she'd signed it over to me on the back, which is enough to make a teller kind of nervous anyway, because, you know, you know, financial instruments are like, everybody is happier when they're on a computer now. So here was a piece of paper with her name on the back, and they were like, really, like, I had a lot of trouble cashing that check, and a lot, but I succeeded ultimately. So yeah, it was, she was, I mean, she wasn't white, but, but I mean, she could pass, you know, and I think, I mean, I know this is an interesting subject for me to talk about, because it's not a subject I ever talked about with her. You know, it wasn't something that she talked about, you know, it was just something that she did, and she did it very selectively. You know, it wasn't as if being a Puerto Rican was was a secret. It was more like something she would only share with you once she got to know you. So there were like all sorts of people who knew all about my mother when she was still a social being. But if, for example, as I write about in the book, a stranger would like spot her on the street and say, ah, and come up to her and speak to her in Spanish, ask her for directions or ask her for, you know, $5 or whatever, she would like, sorry, I don't know what you're saying. And then she would sort of drag me away by the hand. And I'd be like, Mom, what are you doing? And she'd be like, shh.
You know, if I could follow up on that, it's interesting, you know, again, the appreciation of coming to the end of the book first here, because by the end of the book, she is speaking Puerto Rican with, I think it's the super of her building, the last place she lived. I think there's a mention of that in the end. And, you know, it's interesting, part of the pleasure of reading this book twice is that you can see these places where your mom contradicts herself a bit. Early in the book, you say, page 7, my mother frequently told me that I wasn't really Puerto Rican. Unlike her assurance that I wasn't Black, this could sound like a censure, as if I'd betrayed values and traditions that my mother had never made the slightest efforts to pass on, and had instead taken pains to distance herself from. And then on page 269, toward the very end of the book, one day she got annoyed at me for some flippant comment I'd made about a local politician, a Puerto Rican who was in the news for some misbehavior. What's this problem you have with being Puerto Rican? She said, taking me by surprise. I don't have a problem with it, I said, but wait, you always told me that I wasn't Puerto Rican. See page 7. You know perfectly well that I never said such a thing. You were making a point, I think. What could that have been, I wonder? And I delighted in these moments of watching her contradict herself, but but less than the kind of comical aspects of a mother and son battling it out there. I wondered if you would, or could you reflect a little bit? It seemed as if she started to assimilate it or bring it into her life a little bit more easily toward the end of her life. And I wondered if that was
I think that's
accurate.
true. I think that's accurate. I didn't want to come down too heavily on that because that would just seem a little bit too pat. I think it'd just be a little bit too literary to say, my mother has at last reconciled herself to this. You know, I mean, I think it's just too much of a message to say, like, see, my mother, you know, I mean, elsewhere in the book, I said, like, I don't want to impose the trope of the tragic mulatta on my mother because the idea of someone's life falling apart because they deny their racial reality or their racial identity, it's too easy, it's too dumb, it's too objectionable in too many ways. But nevertheless, I do think that there came a point in her life towards its end, as she drew towards the end of her life, when my mother began to think more in terms of, you know, who she was, where she'd ended up, how she'd gotten through, you know, how she'd gotten over basically for 80 years. And I do think that she was a little more receptive to certain ideas or certain self-conceptions that I think she would have kind of automatically shut down, say 20 or 30 or 40 years earlier. I think it just became, I don't know if the word acceptable is correct or palatable. I think she just became more resigned to the idea that, like, this was her life, you know, and, you know, I mean, I don't know, hopefully I've got some time left, but, you know, by the end of your life, you know, you don't want to be sitting there saying, like, this whole thing sucked. I got screwed and like nothing worked out. So, you know, what am I? I'm just waiting to die. I think my mother was probably doing an accounting. I mean, there was a very real sense in the last few years when, after my mother's hospitalization, which I was reading about, she and I actually managed to, like, preserve the peace between us and grow closer. There was definitely a sense I had that she was kind of summing up. That was when she really started talking a lot about being young, about her first marriage, about her marriage to my father, about, you know, the friends they'd had. And so, yeah, I think she was a little less closed off to the reality of, like, you know, not merely where she'd come from, but like the entire culture that she'd sort of carried around inside of herself without ever really opening the container that held it to say, look, I've got this, you know. I mean, I think, I mean, I don't know. I'm not in a position to speculate too much, but I look at, for example, my family, myself and my cousins and, you know, my aunts and uncles. And, you know, I suspect that that was a really strong impulse. You know, my Uncle Jim, my mother's brother, you know, he too was like a very diehard kind of assimilationist. My mother insisted that my mother claimed that he insisted that he no longer knew how to speak Spanish, and she thought he was faking. And all of my cousins have grown up to be very successful, assimilated people, and that seems to have been an objective for the families who raised them, including my grandparents, who the first thing they did when they got over here was like, you know, they started making like pot roast and stuff. You know what I mean? Yeah. I mean, it was that kind of thing. Like they didn't really have any sense of pride. They had a sense of being outsiders and of trying to keep a low profile. And one of the ways in which you managed to do that was by, you know, trying to act as if you belonged there. And I guess the way you did that was by naming your kids like Jim and Vivian, and, you know, serving up butterball turkeys and, you know, cornbread stuffing and, you know.
Deadening the vowels at the end of your name and such. I mean, no, I understood. My father was born in 25, and you know, his birth certificate is Giuseppe Salvatore, but it was Joe Salvatore, you know, as he worked his way out of World War II and into the construction business. You definitely, in the same way that you handle very honestly and responsibly your mom's relationship to race, so too your parents' relationship to class, I think, is really well discussed in this book, because not only are you talking about their experience, but this book is also, in my estimation, a New York City book. It captures a time in New York City that I think doesn't exist anymore. The ability to live an artistic life of the mind and creative life in an area of Manhattan, like Greenwich Village. You say that class presented itself in our daily lives as a set of internally lived contradictions. My parents lived a bohemian life, but they were not especially bohemian in their approach to it. Could you talk a little bit about that class contradiction that you lived at that time?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about because it was really something that you feel in your kishkas, you know, but yeah, there it was. It was like my parents had a kind of, I mean, it helped a lot that they were both, you know, I mean, my father had, if he didn't have OCD, he had something very close to it. If he wasn't on, you know, if he wasn't on the autism spectrum or the Asperger spectrum or whatever the spectrum is referred to nowadays, he was very close to it. And so for him, having a routine, having things be unchangeable every single day, you know, was absolutely key. But my mother was right there with him. I mean, I vaguely remember them like defrosting the refrigerator every week, you know, and I'm like, you know, I had one fridge that needed to get defrosted in my life. And I think I defrosted it once over the year or so that I lived in that place. And only because I couldn't fit my ice cream in there anymore. It really wasn't something where I was trying like, oh man, we've got to keep this thing pristine. So yeah, I think they saw it as a sensibility, or I think the best way to characterize it is as a sensibility. My parents had this very sense like you pay your bills, you don't get in debt over your head, you make sure there's always food in the house, you make sure the kid takes a bath every day, you make sure the kid brushes their teeth every night, you make sure that like the garbage that's taken out and the dishes are washed, and all of this stuff will keep everything in place. You know, like it'll keep the anxiety from creeping in, and it'll keep disorder from creeping in. And if you just manage to live within like the boundaries of this life that you've plotted out for yourself, then all will be well. You know, you don't want to take a chance, you don't want to do anything weird, you don't want to let anything go too far, or else, you know, that's when the devil creeps in and makes everything go crazy. Now, I don't know if there's any particular experiences in either of my parents' pasts that put this sense in their heads, but unfortunately they passed it on to me. You know, so I spent a lot of years like trying to like, you know, not defrost the fridge. I mean, metaphorically, you know. But I'm sorry, I just wanted, I'm not sure I answered Joe's question exactly.
yeah.
You know, I mean, I think the thing is basically my parents were working class people who had managed to find a more interesting way of living. So they were living a kind of bohemian life, but nevertheless, they were inhabiting that bohemian life as sort of visitors direct from, in my father's case, Bay Ridge, and in my mother's case, Morrisania. Like they took the ethos of those two neighborhoods and brought them with them to first the Lower East Side and then Greenwich Village, which made them kind of oddballs because most of the kids I grew up with, like to them, living a bohemian life meant, you know, having bean bags on the floor and using like a giant, you know, cable spool for a coffee table, or you know, what have you, eating Lucky Charms for dinner. You know, I mean, I don't know exactly how it manifested itself for them, but my parents weren't having any of that. You know, it's like hot meal, you know, it's like we ate it like 7, you know, which was a little too late for my dad. You know, he really wanted it at like 6 p.m. But my mother was like, Gil, fuck you. You know, so we did.
When we think of your father, we think truly of an artist. I mean, this is, you know, he's a writer, but he's an artist.
Well,
and yet he's this workaday, you know, I think you say in the book, it's a Depression era ethos that may have pushed him into all this work.
It's like Flaubert's dictum, right? You know, live like a bourgeois so that you can be violent and original in your work. And, you know, and I think that my father, I would be willing to bet that if I were to get my father's copy of, you know, the letters of Gustave Flaubert off the shelf, like, there it would be underlined, because I think that's exactly the way that he kind of rationalized the way he was living to himself. And, you know, in the end, it worked pretty well. You know, I mean, I think it would have been good if they'd gotten out a little more, but, you know, but.
I think part of what you're getting at with that earlier question too is that you and your parents lived at Westbeth, and you know, were able to live, your father was able to live as a writer, your family was able to live with your father as a writer, where today that doesn't happen, right? I mean, writers are professionals, and you mentioned that in so I wonder if that was part of what you were getting at too, this time in New York when Greenwich Village was something else. Not what it is today.
No, I mean, all of Manhattan, really. You know, it's like, and most of Brooklyn at this point, I would say. You know, I mean, there was a, I mean, you know, I have a lot of ambivalence about the way I grew up at this point. You know, if you'd asked me, you know, a few years ago, I said it was great. You know, it's wonderful. There was so much freedom. There was so much going on. But, you know, sometimes I think about it, I'm like, it was kind of a little bit scary for me personally, you know, because there was a little bit too much freedom. You know, I think, I mean, one of the ways, you know, my parents may have been very blue collar about a lot of things, but in terms of like the way that they allowed me to conduct myself, they were very much like my peers' parents. Like, okay, just don't, whatever you're doing, don't do it in our house, you know? So I did it somewhere else, you know, but I think it's a shame, really, is the only thing I can say about what's happened to New York and cities all over the world, really, which have just become sort of these playgrounds that are pretty much riding on the exhaust fumes from the kind of lives that people like my parents were able to live. You know, a lot of what, you know, the very fact that like Soho is a giant shopping mall comes from the fact that Soho used to be a place you'd go and you'd gawk and you'd see all these artists walking around. And I think it's a shame. I think it's a real shame that like there's a kind of, you know, there's no artistic communities per se. There's really just like this sort of scattered world of people with academic appointments or trying to like, you know, do the best they can by getting their loft in like Easton, Pennsylvania, rather than somewhere within the confines of the 5 boroughs, you know. And I think that's really a drag. I think it's, you know, I don't think it's certainly, I've got my own, you know, I've got a stake in this. You know, I would really prefer to be living in, you know, a duplex apartment in Greenwich Village rather than living in a post-war cracker box apartment in Kensington, Brooklyn. But, you know, you do what you can, you know.
the new New York.
One thing we've not really talked about too much yet, or you haven't really talked to us too much about yet, is this other theme in the book, besides your mother, is your parents' marriage.
Right.
And there's this one moment early on in the book where your child, the marriage is a child, and I think it's when maybe the apartment's been broken into, or your mother suspects that somebody's broken in, you go to a neighbor's house and you sit there and you're looking around and you're kind of marveling at other people's lives.
Right.
And I felt that that was sort of the experience as a reader that I often had looking at other people's lives, right? Looking at your life, your parents' life, their marriage. But that's an important theme in the book too.
Well, the marriage was, well, how do you put it? I mean, I would say it was a working disaster. And, you know, and I'm not saying that to be unkind. I'm saying that because I think that, like a lot of people, including me, until comparatively recently, I don't think my parents really had a good way of resolving their problems. You know, I think that their sense, and this is where certain aspects of that working class background, I think, come into play. Like their sense is, okay, we have a disagreement. Let's make sure we've got plenty of cigarettes. And we're just going to sit there and like yell at each other for about 3 hours. And then when we're tired, we'll stop. And then the next time something like this comes up, we'll not only resume the argument more or less intact, but, you know, it'll become, you know, part of, you know, remember that time, you know. So it was, yeah, it was a strange marriage. I think, you know, I think my father was very dependent upon my mother in a lot of ways. I mean, I think he was probably a little more dependent upon her than she was on him. I don't think he would have lasted 11 years had my mother died back in 2006 rather than had he died back in 2006. But I think my mother was also dependent. And, you know, I guess the term for that is codependence, but I'm not going to start throwing that around because I don't really know enough about, you know, the diagnostic criteria for that. But I would say they were two people who were ill-suited to one another, and yet somehow, mysteriously, they suited one another to a T. I also think too, and again, I'm going to invoke the working class background. You know, my father's first marriage failed. My mother's first marriage failed. They both failed for very different reasons. But I think to both of my parents, that was sort of like, okay, I'm not fucking this up again. You know, so if I get married again, then that's it. We're not going to get married. You know, we're not going to get divorced twice. That's just not going to happen, you know. And my mother would make gestures, you know, she would occasionally say things, you know. I have a very vivid memory, which didn't make it into the book, as so much else did not make it into the book, of this time when I came home from school one day and my parents were sitting at the at the dining table, and they were, you know, both clearly agitated. And I did what I always did under the circumstances, which is sort of like give them a wide berth and go into the kitchen to get my ring dings or my yodels or whatever I was getting. And then I just heard my father said something like, well, when am I going to tell so-and-so? And my mother just said, like, for Christ's sake, Gil, just tell him you and your wife are separating. And I was like 11. I was like, shit. So, you know, I went in my room and I thought, you know, I'd seen a lot of movies at that point. So I said, you know what people do at a moment like this? They take a long walk. And so I said, like, okay, I'm going to take a walk. And I remember my father looked at me and he said, Chris. And I said, yeah. And he said, can you pick up a quart of milk on your way? And then that was it. Like the next day, it was like the same as ever. I kept waiting for the shoe to drop. Like, okay, when are they going to tell me, like, officially? You know, I mean, I got the sneak preview, but like, when are they going to sit me down and have that talk that everybody I knew in the 70s had with their parents? And they never did. So, you know, I think it was just, you know, my mother venting. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, it was a weird marriage, and it was a strange marriage to be a witness to. And of course, what's interesting about it is, like, when you're intimately involved with a married couple, so to speak, and you see how they deal with each other every day for like 19 or 20 years, the way I did, like, you know a lot, but you still don't know most of it. And you're not even close to knowing most of it. So like what went on between my parents, what they felt their obligations to one another were, how much they loved each other, how much they despised each other, what it was that drove them really nuts deep inside rather than like the cap left off the toothpaste or the avocado on the windowsill for too long. I don't have any idea. Neither of them ever shared that with me. My mother would vent a lot about my dad after he died, and I would let her do it because I loved my dad a lot, but I loved my mom and I wanted her to tell me these things, but she never really got close. It was always just a variation on, your dad was a real pain in the ass and he made my life miserable and he knew he was doing it and he wouldn't stop. And it's like, okay, fair enough. My father was a pain in the ass. I loved him a lot, but like, I wouldn't have wanted to marry him.
On that point, I think one of the other pleasures for me of this book was, being a married person myself, I thought there were moments where this book was, I was going to say frightening, but perhaps a very sobering cautionary tale about how one navigates one's own needs and then sort of works them out, negotiates them perhaps in the marriage. And I think that the marriage discussion is so beautifully articulated in the section here that I'm going to kind of compress if it's okay. But it's going to lead to a question I want to ask on this topic. Because I think so much of what's happening in this book is us tracing and trying to figure out what is got your mother's goat. Like, what is it? We're going to, is it because Chris wants to be a musician, or is it because Chris leaves, or he aligns himself with her, or does it go back to the birth certificate? Does it go with Dora's abuse? I mean, we're trying to figure, in some ways that's a mystery about this book. But somewhere midway point you say, but my mother's disappointment was keyed to expectations that couldn't really have had her fulfillment as their predicted outcome. Disappointment itself had to have been the predicted outcome. And she must have known that after nearly 20 years that my father was a virtual automaton cutting ahead. If I seem unfairly to be taking my father's side here, it's not quite the case. And this is, I paused and read this so many times. It's more accurate to say that I recognize in my mother the signs of an unwillingness within a relationship to insist upon one's own fulfillment. There are all sorts of ways that people work out their incompatibilities successfully and without constant conflict. But this requires conversation and actions that do more than support the false idea of marriage as a united front, closed against outsiders and outside influences, reinforced by the notion that deviation from the party line is a form of betrayal. And you say this, you go on, I'm almost done here. Within such a structure, my parents were destined to wither, their emotional fate determined by the passive aggression of one and the paralysis of the other. My father did precisely as he liked while pretending to be agreeable to anything my mother wanted, while she grew increasingly incensed as she waited in vain for him to come around, unable to act on her own, unable finally even to speak. It was often blindingly clear what she wanted, but did she ever say, unfathomable mind, now beacon, now see? It's for me, my arm's covered, but there's a little chill there. I felt like there are these moments in the book where, because you're outside of their relationship, it's not really triangulated. You're really quite outside of some of the intimate moments, it seemed to me. Yet when the Chris character, the narrator, when you go in and sort of start ruminating about what could be going on, we end up with these incredibly insightful passages that just moves, I'll speak for myself, but moves the reader really intensely, depending on what you're going through in your own life. To come to such an awareness of that, I come back to the early relationship with your mom. You guys were inseparable at the early days. It was you and her kind of running errands and go to the library, and her defending you in little dust-ups you have with bullies. Your father succeeded, regardless of his obsessions, in kind of finding his dream, fulfilling his life's work. It seems like your mother didn't. And it seems like somehow the root of all of her anger seems to be something about an unfulfilled life. Did she ever give any sort of voice to that other than her anger?
No, I mean, that's one of the mysterious things, is I think the way my mother dealt with being disappointed was just by acting as if the way things were the way that either the way they were meant to be or the way that she set it up. Like I did this on purpose, you know, like when a cat falls off the couch, like, no, I meant that. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think my father knew what he wanted to do and he knew how to achieve it. And of course, you know, we're talking the 1960s, the 1970s, everything was stacked in his favor. You know, my father was a man, a white man. He was, you know, it was a patriarchal world, and publishing was, you know, important writers were white men. And so even though my father was never a terribly successful writer, I mean, he had a reputation, but he never sold. But nevertheless, you know, he still got the goodies and he still got the good appointments and that kind of thing. Whereas my mother, you know, I think it would have taken a lot of doing to do what she might have wanted to do, you know, to go back to Vivian Gornick, her paisana, you know, it's like, Gornick had to sort of struggle to go to college. If I recall correctly, she lied to her mother and told her that she was going to be a teacher when in fact she was studying literature. And, you know, then Gornick had to like live a rather hand-to-mouth life. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not sure if she's still, you know, if she's financially secure yet. And I think Vivian Gornick is almost 90 now. And I'm not sure if how she's living. I hope she's living well. But, you know, I think for my mother, it was, I think I talk about this a lot in the book, and it's difficult for me to talk about because it is speculative and it's almost maudlin. So it makes me a little uncomfortable to kind of emphasize it. But I have often thought, like, you know, it was me. I screwed it up. You know, if my mother had not gotten pregnant with me, she could have unloaded my dad after a couple of years and, you know, done whatever she might have done. She might have gone to like CCNY, you know, or something like that. She might have done anything she wanted to do, moved to another part of the country, you know, gotten a job where she met someone who wasn't a crazy writer who, you know, wore clothes until they had holes in them and, you know, lived in apartments without heat. Like there are a million things she could have done. So yeah, I think it's difficult. I mean, we really do have a situation here, and this is part of the book that is, I guess, comparatively understated, but definitely a lot of the women I've talked to who've read it have picked up on it right away. It's sort of like a book that is, you know, looking really hard at what options were available to a woman, a single woman of color, a single woman of color who is not coming from any kind of background of privilege or other, you know, other circumstances that might have made things easy to try and push past, you know, the limitations that seem to have been set up, the obstacles that seem to have been set up in her path. And she just never solved that, you know, I mean, and whether or not I blame myself, like I said, that's a little bit maudlin and a little bit self-indulgent, but the fact remains that like having a kid is an obstacle. I mean, I took care of my oldest daughter until she was 5 years old, and I didn't get a lot of writing done during those years. I got a lot of mopping done, you know, and it was tough, you know, and I resented it. I mean, I talk about it a little bit in the book, not too terribly much, but I was sort of like, damn, you know, it's like, is this what it is? Me like mopping shit up and like going to the park and standing in the heat while the kid goes, blah, blah. It's like, Jesus, like, get a life, kid, you know, like read a book. Sorry, Violet. But yeah, I mean, I think it's rough. And for my mother, that was like open-ended. I mean, I could go back. Like my kid went into school and I sat down and started writing a novel. Whereas I went to school and like my mother was like, now what? And then I would come home and say to her, like, yeah, who needs you? You know, it's like a good, proper little creep. That's right. I would quickly, you know, I began ganging up on her too. Like you know, not a good look, but you know, there it was.
Follow up and then please, Chris, if I may, you know, you mentioned that there are things that didn't make it into this book, and I say with all sincerity that I could imagine follow-up memoirs. Forgive me, because I want you to get back to your 300-page book that you're figuring out the solution to. But and I'm sincere when I say in the tradition of Nazgad, and that is to say, there were places in the book that I was really curious about that I thought you were going to show me the regular traditional memoir approach that you talked about with the epiphanic ending, where you start to make sense of it all in a literary way. And we were going to sort of see things get solved and answered in some sort of Freudian way, perhaps, but that never happens. And one of the things that I think is really an absence in the book, deliberately, certainly one of them is your father, which we can talk about perhaps, and when, you know, as we're coming close on time, but the other one is you. And it's mentioned several times. I'm gonna read one quick little quote. But because of your disclosure that you just shared now, I feel it's appropriate that I say, there are many moments in this book where you edge up close to suggesting that there's a kind of inheritance of dysfunctionality, if I could use that word. You don't use it. But these bad marriages, this stuff, and you say this, you say, although having somewhat impulsively myself ended a marriage and survived the complex, disillusioning, painful, and expensive aftermath, I'm not quite able to figure out why my mother, who periodically threatened to divorce my father, never got around to doing the same thing for what appeared to be far more solid reasons. And later, when your mom bumps into a man who we don't really know. He says something like, hey, don't I know you? And she brushes him off very quickly. And you say that the boy, and he says, well, who was that? And she says, no, nobody. And you say the boy accepted that answer. But then you say, and I'm not going to find the quote now, but you say later, the man who understood his own relationship to sexual duplicities and such things. And that quote is in there. Nell is mentioned early in the book. You mentioned her tonight. Just generally speaking, since it's not in the memoir, but the memoir seems to be asking, or the author seems to be saying, how did this affect me? And you touch on different places. And certainly a driving aspect of the book is how toward the end of her life, your mom maintained, and you mentioned it in this reading, a very close relationship with your first wife, but has these problems with your second marriage. And I wondered, again, you never ever talk about it in here, but I suppose a follow-up volume might be, or perhaps never would be. What did you think was the impact of, you know, they say, you know, the parents who don't get divorced maybe mess the kid up more than the parents that do get divorced. And I'm not suggesting that they're any messed up.
Well, I'm pretty messed up.
But, no. But you know, yeah, and in fact, early in the book, when you're a young man, you say that you were in therapy as a young man too. There's a section in there as well. So I was thinking about this aspect of the psychology of the narrator and how what happened to the parents and what was witnessed impacted you.
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm a little reluctant to assign all of my pathologies to my parents, you know, bad parenting, because I think on the whole, they weren't that terrible. And I really, you know, to preface this a little bit, I would say growing up in the 1970s in Greenwich Village, you know, as wonderful as it was, it was also like, you know, full of kids who, as I alluded to earlier, were running wild. And one of the reasons why they were running wild is because dad was off, you know, doing something, and mom had been left the task of like raising kids and, you know, walk up on Jane Street or something. And so, you know, these kids were at sea, whereas I had parents who actually expected me to be places and expected me to do things until I became an adolescent, at which point I became a little bit too difficult to manage, as adolescents tend to do. And, you know, I went out and did as I wished. And I think my parents were, sort of pleased to be rid of me because I wasn't really a fun person to be around at home. But I would say that in terms of their, you know, it wasn't, I don't think it was necessarily the way that they raised me that messed me up. It may have had more to do with watching them relate to each other.
That was the point of my question.
Okay,
it wasn't how they raised you.
Okay.
No.
All right.
It was witnessing some of this tension that you described so well.
I am a combative person. I am a verbose person. I've been told that I am a verbally aggressive person. I have been told that I'm a little too clever to, you know, to argue with, because I'm really good at like either pointing out other people's sophistry or resorting to sophistry of my own in order to like win a point. I am, you know, I'm no stranger to yelling. And as I also refer to numerous times in the book, but never quite come out and address, I was a big drunk for a long time. You know, and that really messed up a lot of stuff because, you know, one of the things about being drunk is that for a long time, you don't really acknowledge that you're drunk. And so when other people are like sort of giving you a hard time about being drunk or not giving you a hard time at all, and you just happen to be drunk, you're like, what are you doing? And so, well, I mean, it's kind of funny now, but I mean, you know, you talk to my first wife or you talk to Minna for that matter, and they'll both tell you like what an asshole he was. I'm glad he stopped, you know. And yeah, I think watching my parents interact with each other gave me this sense that like what a marriage involves is like, if you really, really love someone, you can yell at them really loud for a long time and it's going to be okay because the marriage never stops, you know. And I remember the first time I started, you know, when I started dating, in effect, you know, 40 years ago or so, like I was always kind of amazed the way girls would be like, okay, I'm getting up and leaving now. And I'm like, I'm still yelling. What do you? So yeah, I don't know. It was, they were not, they weren't discussants as we are. They were yellers, and they were not really trying to solve problems. They were just sort of venting at each other. And it's funny because that really did, I really did adopt that like a second skin for many, many years until I was, you know, in my late 40s, I would say. And it wasn't good for me, and it wasn't good for the women in question who were in my life. And I'm glad to have seen an argument as being a way of, you know, kind of, I now see an argument as a way of maybe resolving an issue or tabling it, rather than just saying like, guess what? We have an excuse to yell for a long time. Because I think that's what I took away from my parents was like, well, they're not really solving anything. My mother's talking about, you know, cutting the butter from the wrong end of the stick again. You know, it's like, when is she going to realize that nobody cares what end of the stick you cut the butter from except for her? And yet we could actually build, my father wrote, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt myself here, but I just suddenly reminded myself, one of my father's last books, probably my favorite of all his books at this point, a book called Little Casino. My father has it's a book mainly of vignettes, and one of the vignettes in the book is called The Tomato Episode. And, you know, anybody out there who's got the book should look it up immediately, because what it's about is about this man and his wife, and he cuts the wrong tomato for dinner. And they have an argument on the basis of his having cut the tomato. And he, you know, I wish I could remember how he phrases it, but he phrases it quite wonderfully. He talks about the way in which the tomato is like this innocent object that serves as a pretext for rousing all of these monstrous ghosts that are just lurking behind the facade of the marriage, so that they can step forward again and assert themselves as like living issues. And I was like, that was maybe the most autobiographical thing my father ever succeeded in writing, because it was like, I recognized immediately that he was basing this vignette on his relationship with my mother. And I was like, okay, so he saw what was going on, but he just couldn't, you know, he couldn't help himself, you know, and neither could she. Like if he baited her, she rose to the bait. If she baited him, he often wouldn't rise to the bait, but eventually she could get him angry. And when she did, those were like the, you know, like the thriller in Manila, man. Like you'd fly to see it, or you'd run away to avoid seeing it.
Let's see. I think we've covered a lot of the things that I was interested in talking about. And I think it's interesting, and I wondered maybe about the structure a bit of the memoir and the opening and closing with you discovering your mother's body. I don't know if you want to say something about how that. I mean, because it's so detailed and so vivid that, I don't know, I mean, one could imagine perhaps a memoir that didn't include those kinds of details. And so I wondered what kind of work that was doing for the memoir. And
well, I think the work it was doing was, I'm not sure if this is omnidirectional. I think the work that it was doing was in effect to sort of allow my mother's death to sort of body forth as something corporeal. Gosh, that's 3 bodies. But I wanted the reader to be able to see where that loneliness left her in the end, because I think I always knew that I was going to find my mother one day. And I kind of hoped it wouldn't happen. I hoped something normal would happen, like she'd have a coronary infarction and be in the hospital or something, I mean, not anything that would have been for her benefit, but for my own, like there she is, like take her to the morgue, boys. But instead, no, she died at home. She died unexpectedly. And, I felt at the time that I hadn't been as attentive as I might have been. And, I guess that's an open question and not what I'm going to even attempt to, grapple with now, except to say, like, I felt really ashamed when I found her. And I felt ashamed that her neighbors knew that she'd been found like 2 weeks later by the person who was supposed to care about her. So I wanted to put that there. I wouldn't say to inflict it on the reader, but to not shield it from the reader. I wanted the reader not to think of the body as like just sort of a peaceful corpse resting there, but something that had really been ravaged by its having been neglected for as long as it had been, and me having to deal with that somewhat. And so I opened with it. There had been some throat clearing prior to that. I'd done some stuff that the objective of which was to sort of say, like, well, why write a memoir about your mother? That kind of thing, like, getting into it. When I had the first draft, like I just kept trying to make that first chapter, the introductory chapter, work, and it just didn't. It was just, like, let's get right to this. And then once we've gotten this out of the way and sort of established, the conditions that preceded the actual writing of the memoir, I can go on to like just track her life. And otherwise, there really wasn't, structurally, this was the simplest book I've ever written, because all I decided to do was just like, let's take it on chronologically, so I just deal with her from cradle to grave and just a little bit beyond. And it seemed appropriate for her. It really did. Just like, here's a woman nobody thought about much. Well, now I want people to think about her, in a strange way. I mean, she might think it's a lousy gift, but I think of this book as being kind of a gift to her. Like, okay, Mom, I mean, it was kind of, I think it was kind of hard to be an adjunct, like that's what she was. She was, I think she knew that for a lot of people, she was merely an adjunct to my illustrious father. And I don't think my father, for as many faults, I don't think my father ever made her feel like he was the big man and she was like the little spouse behind him. But I do feel as if it was inevitable, and certainly enough other people made no effort to make her feel any like she had any importance, like she was just like the wife of, the significant writer. And, so I wanted her to have this, I wanted it to be just about her. And that goes to like the question you'd alluded to, I guess, a little bit before we started, Joe, about like why my father is not a big presence in this book. It's not his. I think you get enough of him, coming in at the edges. I think with my father, it's, for the purposes of this narrative, at least, you can just establish certain premises about him that the reader can then just take as givens. Like, okay, my father, he's work-centric. He's, he just sits down and he does this stuff, and nothing's going to stop him, and nothing's going to make him break his stride. And when he does break his stride, he gets into a state of near psychosis, So that was all we really needed from him. We just needed to see him as something that, like, was always there, ready to complicate what might have been something simple for my mother. You know, like there's a little section in the book where I describe, you know, how my father lost his job at Grove Press, where he was a senior editor. They had a wave of firings, and my father started working, you know, he started being at home and writing all the time. And it was this great thing for him. But suddenly, like, no sooner had my mother gotten me off to school for 6 hours every single day than suddenly my father was home for those 6 hours every day. And I was a much less of a pain in the ass than my father was, because my father was always like, you know, you could please set your watch by him. You know, like I'd sit there and like at 1 o'clock, my father would kind of straggle out of his study and say, how about a little lunch, babe? You want a sandwich? You know, and then you'd hear my mother, if I was home from school, you'd hear my mother saying, God damn it, Gil, put 3 slices on. And it's like, okay, babe, whatever you want, you know, like so yeah, I mean, that's why he's not really in the book much. And I don't remember the original question anymore.
It makes complete sense. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to just say that we should probably see if there are any questions here, but I think the attention that you paid to a person who I think needed or didn't get enough attention in life is perfectly instantiated in the moments where you discovered her. And how right was it? Not to be holding her hand when she died, but to discover her and to pay attention to her. And the descriptions, though difficult to read, are attentive to the most private moment anyone could ever have. And you are the person who pays attention to that moment. I think it's a poignant and beautiful way to structure the book. We only have a few minutes left, and
we do have some questions.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Who will ask those questions? Okay, great.
Okay. It's like a lightning round.
Right.
Charles wants to know, could the author talk about what he called 50 years of deracination?
Deracination?
Sorry.
Yes, I could talk about that. What I simply was referring, I think, I mean, I don't have the passage open before me, so I can't contemplate my deathless prose, but I think all I meant about that was the way in which, you know, first you have people immigrating to the United States from wherever they happen to come from. And then you have people in the United States, especially after the war, kind of flying to the 4 corners of the country, you know, just people who are, you know, they grow up in the Rust Belt and they move to California or Florida or New York or Seattle or whatever they do. And, you know, it's just no longer a kind of, you know, world in which communities stay knit together for generation after generation, you know, and I may be romanticizing that a little bit, but I do think too that like the anti-romantic view is that, yeah, it sounds a little weird. I mean, my older daughters are in 2 different places, and I kind of wish they still lived in Brooklyn. But on the other hand, this is where they've found opportunities, and it's made them happier. And you know, my older daughter certainly has no desire to live in New York City anymore. So that's really all I meant is like we've moved away from the places where you know, conventional wisdom would have, we should all be in the village and we should all stay in the village. But I think it's better because those boy husbands and child brides don't really happen anymore, you know, and like in the village where my great grandfather was from, like everybody just stayed there until one day my great grandfather said, hey, let's go to the United States. And then suddenly, you know, the world opened up for them. I don't know if that's a real answer was it Charles? Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Charles. I can elaborate. You can email me. Just
there's another question. This is from an anonymous. When writing, what is your progress as you start and move into the book? Do you create an outline?
I don't usually, but I would say that every single book I've written has set up its own procedural rules as I've gone. Like none of them has conformed to what the preceding book has done. In this case, I did not make an outline. In this case, what I did was I simply plowed ahead using the calendar. You know, it's like, okay, we're going to start in 1930. Well, I guess we'll start with my my grandparents' lives, and then we'll just move to my mother, through my mother's life, and we're going to do it all more or less chronologically. And stuff that got included kind of willy-nilly. In the revision process, I was able to like place some things in sort of more effective juxtaposition with other things, but a lot of what I wrote just came out. I wouldn't say that I was a process of automatic writing or anything, but it was certainly written very, very quickly for me. It took me about a year to write a draft of this book. And so no to outlines. That's never really been my process, but never say never,
That's it for the questions.
Wow, okay.
Wow.
So I just, if you can join me in thanking Christopher Sorrentino and our discussants, Joseph Salvatore and Vanessa Perez Rosario. Thank you very much.
You have my
and to you
thanks.
guys.